I'm Lori Dawson, and for those of you who don't know me, and along with my Meetup co-chair, Sherry Gray, and the board, we welcome you. We're thrilled to have league members from the Capital Region and maybe even across the state. Maybe we'll find out later. And thanks so much to the League of New York State for distributing our notice about this event. We really appreciate that. If there's anyone on this Zoom who is not a member of the League, we invite you to join us. You will find the membership information on our website by clicking the big red join button. And I just wanted to express, because we were talking about this earlier, that we are so grateful to all the League members who help register people to vote and staff the numerous candidate events happening in our communities right now. We have a candidate event that's happening tonight while we're here even. And we just couldn't do all that we do without all those volunteers. And also much appreciation to our board who chair or work on numerous committees and meet monthly to consider and make decisions for our leagues. We hope that you might consider joining the board when called to serve sometime in the future. Keep checking the League of Women Voters of Saratoga County website for upcoming events and candidate events, and look for our Saratoga County email notices. I want to give much appreciation to Chris Alexander for maintaining our website and Linda McKenney for sending our email notices. Meetups are a way for us to come together to explore, understand, and advocate for issues that matter to us. They are focused on our members and their interests. Meetups are open to all, so we invite you to invite friends and register or attend any upcoming meetups, which are held on the third Wednesday of the month. Our next meetup, which was being asked about, will be on November 16th at 6:30 to 8, and it will be on Zoom. It is entitled Bail Reform and Racial Disparities in Criminal Justice. Our speaker will be Catherine Hubbard, who is the Deputy Director of Litigation at Civil Rights Corps, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to challenging systemic injustice in the United States legal system, a system that is built on white supremacy and economic inequality. The registration info will be sent via email and posted on our events webpage soon. We will not be having a December meetup. I don't know if we're going to be having a holiday gathering. Hopefully we will. And we will be meeting January, February, March, some on Zoom, hopefully some in person. So look for announcements about those upcoming meetups. Okay, a reminder to stay muted unless called on to speak. Please enter questions only, no comments, in the public chat so the presenter can see the questions more easily. And he will address them as they appear or at the end. And I will now turn the mic over to Pat Nugent, who I hear is heading up the Women's Rights Awareness Campaign, and she organized tonight's meetup. Pat, to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lori, and thanks to you and Sherry for coordinating these every month of topics that are of particular interest and timely. So thank you both. When the League Program Planning Committee chose topics for 2022-23, we all readily agreed that as an organization on the front lines of defending the democratic process, we must sponsor a program on election integrity before the all-important midterm elections, the first significant national election since the January 6th insurrection. Our choice of a speaker was also quite obvious, but Liz Cheney declined. She's somewhat busy these days. In truth, our first choice was Christopher Mann, who came highly recommended to us from a few sources. And to my delight, he readily said yes. There was no chasing him. He wasn't dodging us. He said yes right away. However, he said, do not title this program Election Integrity, because that's an overused term by both sides of the political divide. He wisely calls his presentation Ensuring Fair, Accessible, and Accurate Elections. Seems like a reasonable goal in a democracy, right? then why is it slipping away from us? A recent New York Times headline based on Siena College polling read, "Voters see democracy in peril, but saving it isn't a priority." I, for one, can't sleep nights with the awareness that voters are open to anti-democratic candidates. And I keep thinking about what is mine to do. Judging by our large turnout tonight, I'm not the only one popping melatonin or bourbon. And I'm not sure if Chris will make us sleep better or worse tonight, but it's important that we understand the scope of what's plaguing our elections. And it's good to know he's on the case. When I first approached Chris, I naively told him he'd be co-presenting with someone from the Board of Elections. But when I reached out to the New York State Board of Elections, since we're so close to Albany, I was told they have no outreach program for community education. They told me to contact our County Board of Elections using a form on their website, which I did, yet received no response. I'm not sure how to interpret that, but it concerns me on some level. We need all hands on deck right now. However, Dr. Mann has no problem going solo tonight. He's worked on voting rights, election administration, and voter participation for 3 decades as a scholar and political professional. His academic research focuses on the effects of changing rules about pre-election day voting and voter registration. Prior to becoming a professor, he led a civic organization, political campaigns, and a political data consulting firm. He continues to consult with civic, philanthropic, and political organizations about voting rights, election administration, and voter mobilization. He's currently an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College, member of the advisory board at the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and most importantly, he says, a proud father of 2 future voters, we hope. So Chris, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for having me here tonight. I will promise you that I have 2 future voters. They wear their future voter t-shirts proudly. If they could vote today, they certainly would. I have some slides to show you all. But first, I want to say thank you to all of you at the League of Women Voters for having me here, for having forums like this, but also for being such a resource. I send my students to your candidate forums to watch those videos. You do such tremendous work there, and near and dear to my heart, especially the work you do around election reform here in New York and around the country. So thank you for that. I don't have it in my slides and I don't want to forget it. So I'll take something that Pat said as the first question that I want to address as we go along. In the community that I work in of scholars and advocates, this question of the lack of communication capacity from election administrators is a really big challenge. Before 2020, for the most part, election officials didn't need that. Some of my research probably a decade ago looked at the fact that election officials, if you look at their budget, and even if you try to generously attribute money that they have for communication, they average somewhere between 10 cents and 25 cents per voter across the country in various states. New York is not one of those states, but I have no reason to believe it's any different. And there's a lot of talk about people who work with election officials to make them better communicators. Former colleague of mine at Skidmore, who's now at Connecticut College, is doing a big project looking at the social media strategies that election officials are using, because they are really, a lot of them are trying hard, but just don't have that capacity. And that is one of those things that sort of goes under the radar. But that lack of capacity to communicate is a problem. And for better or for worse, as many of you probably know, you are one of the resources at the League of Women Voters that people turn to in the absence of election administrators for trusted information about those things. I I wish they had more resources, but thank you for filling that gap. But it is part of the conversation that I think we will be having after this election. I hope we're having after this election about improving that capacity. That is not to make excuses for the New York board or the Saratoga County board or any others in the capital region. But it's a real challenge because they are not like the governor's office. They don't have a press person. They don't have a communications director. They don't have a social media director. But they need one because we need to be communicating more and better. All right, with that digression behind me, let me share my screen here. I can see the chat. And what I will do as we go along here is I will keep an eye on it. And if there are questions that I can answer as we go along, I will do so. Otherwise, I will hold them for the end of the process. So Pat introduced the title. Oops. I want to start with this quote from Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who came to Harvard to give a commencement address. And normally when prime ministers or other leaders from countries come to give these kinds of addresses in the United States, they tend to address international problems or things that are important to their own country. But Prime Minister Ardern used this moment, not entirely, but largely to talk about the threats to democracy around the world. And when the threat to democracy around the world and the threat to democracy in the United States has risen to a level where other leaders of other countries feel compelled to comment on it, it is a powerful sign and not a promising sign about the fragility of our democratic values here in the United States, around the world, but what democracy here in the United States means. I'll be honest, Pat suggested this. I'm probably not going to help Pat's nightmares very much. My goal is to try to explain what's going on, to get a little deeper, hopefully a lot deeper than what a lot of our news media coverage has been. My students today in class, one of them referred to election nerds, and then everybody in the class stopped and sort of gasped and looked at me, and I proudly embraced that title of being an election nerd. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey into the land of election nerds. I suspect that I am in good company here. I want to quickly take a look back at 2020, because where we are today and a lot of the challenges we face, not just in the madness of the rhetoric about voting and the misinformation, but a lot of election administration, how elections are run, is profoundly impacted by the 2020 election. So first, I want to remind you of where the 2020 election sits. So we had this rise in turnout that is widely attributed to Barack Obama, but actually started in 2004 and the John Kerry George Bush election, which was nobody's idea of charismatic candidates. And we sort of shifted up, if you will, in presidential elections. But then we slipped a little bit. And then, of course, we had 2014. And I think I gave a similar talk down at the library that was co-sponsored by League of Women Voters, the library here in Saratoga Springs after that election, talking about just how terrible that election was. But then, of course, we get 2018, where turnout rockets back up. And 2016, again, turnout is up. In some ways, that's a good sign that people are participating. But political scientists always look at it as something that we should worry about, because we often see the highest turnout when we are most polarized and people really are most alarmed. I also want to note that 2020 was, not only was it high turnout, it was high turnout everywhere. So this map is from the Washington Post. Those states that are highlighted in yellow are the only ones that did not break a 40-year record in turnout. So this is red states, blue states, purple states that we see having remarkably high turnout. But the big thing about 2020 is the almost inversion of these pie charts. And pie charts are usually, when I teach research methodology, not a very good way of visualizing most data, but it's really an effective way of visualizing the fact that we switched from before election day, from voting primarily on election day to primarily voting before election day. I said that terribly. Read the graphs, don't listen to me. right? This is a massive change. And one of the big questions about elections and what's happening this year is whether this repeats, and I'll talk about mail ballots and their role in that again, and how political elites respond to that. Another way of putting this in perspective, so this is data from Professor Mike McDonald, the University of Florida. If we take the total amount of votes cast in 2016, before we got to election day, we had 111 million votes cast. That was almost 3/4 of all votes cast in 2016. And as you saw, it's about 70% of the total that was cast in 2020. This is a sea change. And especially in states that didn't have much pre-election day voting, including here in New York, prior to 2020, it is a massive change. This is the trend line. Election day voting has been going down. Mail ballots have been going up. That's that turquoise line, early in person. It's also been generally rising, bumping up and down a little bit in midterms and presidentials. But then we see this huge spike in mail and absentee voting in 2016. Noticeable shift upwards in early in-person voting, and in particular, plummeting voting. As a mode of voting, election day went from majority to not even the plurality in 2020. This shows you how mail ballots have driven this. The darker the states, on the left we have 2016, on the right we have 2020. Really shifting towards using mail ballots in lots of places, including a number of states that now mail ballots to everyone, including our neighbors just to the east in Vermont. But it was largely a partisan phenomenon. So this is the use of mail ballots in the last several presidential elections. If we go back to 2008, it was just barely used more by Republicans. And if you went at the state level, we had some states where it was more Democrats, somewhere it was more Republicans. That was also true in 2012. Democrats do it a little bit more. 2016, they do it a little bit more. But if you went across the country, you have some states where it's more Republicans, more Democrats. We see a bit of an uptick in 2020, but it really became identified with Democrats. Not least because we had former President Trump attacking this, suppressing the number of Republicans who might have shifted for COVID pandemic related reasons, and Democrats in many ways almost embracing it more than expected because it became a partisan identity thing to do. So that's going to be the foundation of stuff I'm going to talk about in a minute. I also want to take a look back to 2018 and focus on how much the electorate is changing. This is a generational map of turnout. And we can see the turnout rate of the silent generation and baby boomers is the highest. Gen X and millennials are there. What's notable here is the big sharp upward shift, of course, from 2014 when it was turnout was very low. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to is how big those shifts are for Gen X, especially the millennials, and Gen Z who voted in their first midterm. They're starting at a higher level. They're climbing much more quickly than past generations. You can see this a little bit. We go almost back far enough to see the baby boomers, not the silent generation, but they're starting at a higher level and they're coming up quickly. And that generational piece, 2018 was the first electorate where boomer and older generations were a smaller number of total votes cast than the younger generations. And so this continued into 2020 and is likely to continue, and in fact grow. That gap is likely to grow as we see the turnout in 2022. The gender gap, and I made this slide for a previous presentation before the Dobbs decision, but I do want to talk about the Dobbs decision and how this will drive it. We have an electorate that has always been, with the exception of the 65 plus group, but for a long time now we have more women participating than men. In 2018, we saw that gap grow even larger. Many political scientists attribute that to a backlash against the misogynistic behavior and rhetoric of former President Trump. this gender gap is larger among young voters. And when we look at polling data about 2022 in the wake of the Dobbs decision, when we look at political engagement by a number of metrics, whether it's voter registration, voting in primaries, a number of other things, we see that among younger voters, women are much more likely to be new registrants since this Dobbs decision. Turnout in primaries went up. The Kansas primary, which of course was the first one, had abortion on the ballot. We saw turnout among women, that gender gap be large across all age groups. And so when we say the future is female, that is particularly true of has been true of our electorate, but will be probably increasingly true, driven by Dobbs, as well as these sort of underlying long-term trends. So Dobbs is important, but it's not the only thing driving the engagement of women in politics. This is a much longer term trend. Even though those gaps grew in 2018, they're there back in 2014. The electorate is becoming more diverse. One thing in particular that I want to note is over on the lower right here, you can see this zigzag up and down where the midterm electorate is much more white through 2014. Than the presidential electorate. The trend line is still down, but we get this sawtooth kind of thing going on from 2000, but that seems to have flattened out. And we have rates of participation that are equalizing in midterm elections in ways that are, causing our electorate to look differently. And to be clear, Linda Clark raised a question. I am not trying to slam President Trump. I don't think it is, well, it's not my intention to. I do think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that he spoke a lot more than any presidential candidate has ever spoken about elections. And he was extremely critical of voting by mail. In ways that not all Republicans agreed with. And I'll talk a little bit more about, I think that's why that's driving the pattern that we saw on the previous slide. Confidence in voting. Here's the good news. This has been now pretty routine for pollsters to measure this. This is a poll from USC, but you can look at the same data from lots of places. This is now a fairly classic way to ask this question about how confident people are that their own ballot was counted correctly. And you can see Democrats are a little more confident. This was collected before Election Day, so before we get a winner's effect, where the winning side is always a little bit more confident, or sometimes a lot more confident. People's confidence across partisanship is pretty high, right at the 70% level. That's the good news. The bad news is that when we ask about votes counted nationwide, we see a pretty stark partisan disparity here. And this plays out, this is a good chunk of this is the kind of expected winners effect. So this is a different set of polls, different questions to have the time series here. But we look at Democrats and Republicans. So 2012, we see this sort of what's considered classic winners effect. 2016, we see the same thing. Republicans become much more confident. Democratic confidence dips, not down to that level that we see from Republicans in 2012, but still a notable drop of 15 percentage points. What we see in 2020 that has caused some alarm is this very large drop down to only 1 in 4 Republicans saying that they are confident about the vote nationwide, and an unexpectedly high spike among Democrats. And there are other polls that aren't the exact same poll that you can graph this a little farther back, kind of on and off. This is work by Charles Stewart, and he's graphed this back to 2000 when people first started asking this question. Of course, we know there was a lot of rhetoric in the run-up to and in the wake of the election, challenging the integrity of the election. One thing I want to really highlight here is one of the things that concerns me and many other close observers of this is that this fragility that Prime Minister Ardern, the word that she used in her speech at Harvard, there's a great deal of concern that we could end up in a situation in the midterm election or in a future presidential election where we start to see this not zigzagging, but a downward trend. So Democrats having this losers effect and seeing them swing down to that 1 in 4 kind of number that we see from Republicans in 2020, particularly if we get Democratic elites criticizing the election in different ways. Democrats have different critiques of elections. But you know, for example, you can take Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor again in Georgia. And if you look at this question in Georgia in the wake of 2018, Democratic confidence was not quite down to 23%, but well under 50% among Georgia Democratic voters, because she was talking about an election stolen in different ways, disenfranchisement, voter intimidation, unfair rules, right? It's a different critique. But if we get Democratic elites who launch those same kinds of critiques, that this is a very fragile thing. And if we start to look at a situation where both Democrats and Republicans don't recover, right? It's hard to see how, if Republican confidence, they win an election, they have a 40-point swing back up, now they're only rising back up into the 70s. And if we get that sort of swinging back and forth and we get a long-term undermining, that this is really potentially concerning. I also want to put the United States in perspective here. Just recently, I was at a conference in Montreal with a bunch of international scholars looking at this challenge of elections and the challenges to how our elections are run around the world. And one of the things that I came away from that with was really thinking about how the United States is not exceptional. We often like to think of ourselves as exceptional, the first, one of the largest democracies, but we don't really live up to that billing. So this shows it to you. So this is based on an expert assessment, and that's not a perfect, by far from perfect way to measure elections. But if you look at the United States, we're above the middle of this score range, but we are not at the top. We're certainly lagging behind others. And if you look at this in a list form, I'm going to zoom in here. If you look at these countries that are around us with similar kinds of ratings on this, these are not the countries that we are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as being around in terms of democracies. Some of these are countries that may very well give a lot of Americans pause to say, wait, you know, we're behind Brazil, Mexico, El Salvador, right? In North America, we're around countries like Myanmar that where, you know, there are big questions about the robustness of their democracy. And this is where international experts are putting our election system in terms of rating very much, you know, a bit above the midpoint, but very much kind of in the middle of this. There is also considerable variation in the way elections are run and where it's easiest and hardest to vote across the country. Here in New York, we fall almost dead smack in the middle, rating 26 in 2016. So this is cost of voting is basically the burden in time and effort on scholars on voters. Scholars have critiqued this, so I don't want to say this is a definitive ranking, but generally it passes the most people's sense of where voting is easy and where it is difficult. They updated this for 2020. You see some shifts here. The brighter green is easier and the lighter colors are harder. Generally, states are in the same neighborhood. New York moved up a little bit. That's largely a function of our adoption of early in-person voting. But you can see that there's considerable variation in the gaps across the hurdles that people have to meet in order to vote vary a great deal. So we should not be having a national conversation about voting and election integrity. We should be having 51 conversations, 50 states plus DC, about this. And the challenges across each of these states are very different. The critiques across all of these states are very different, depending on the way in which they register people to vote. Can people register to vote on election day, during early in-person voting? Do they have online voter registration? Those are all quite different challenges. Is it early voting? Is it election day only? Are there mail ballots? What are the rules around mail ballots? all of those things create very different challenges around having a fair, accurate, and election with integrity. I'm not going to dwell on this, but not surprisingly, turnout is somewhat, but not that related, right? We get some outliers here. Hawaii is supposed to be, we would expect it to be a little higher than it is. New Hampshire, Minnesota, Wisconsin, way above the line. So this ranking has something to do with turnout, but it isn't everything. I want to talk about how our nation is divided about voting. This is a map of legislative control. We have a lot of states with unified control. The yellow and the green and gray colors here are divided control of the legislature and the governorship in different configurations. Red and blue are states that are controlled entirely by one party or the other. Population-wise, it's relatively close together, but in a number of states, it definitely tilts towards Republicans. And when we play this out, public attitudes are quite different. So these graphs are showing, these are what are called forced choice questions. Democrats and Democratic leaners heavily saying everything should be done to make it easy for citizens to vote. Republicans saying that citizens should really have to prove that they want to vote. More importantly, is actually, to me, is the lower part of this, is expectations of what happens if rules are changed to make it easier to register and vote. Democrats don't think it would make any difference in the security of elections. Republicans are much more likely to say that it will make a difference. And these graphs explain a lot of why Republicans and Democrats in elected office, policymakers are hearing very different constituencies if they are listening to their co-partisans about what we should do in elections. What we have seen and what is often overlooked in the news media is that there are a number of states, including here in New York, as well as some states that have some notoriety for passing restrictive laws, have passed expansive laws, making it easier to access the ballot. These are just in effect for the midterms. There's a handful of states that will have additional expansive laws that go into effect after this election. What gets a lot of attention is restrictive laws, and that story in the news media is extremely misleading because this map does not look like the way the news media talks about it, including the fact that we here in New York never get singled out for the fact that some of the moves that we have made. We have a lot of purple states. In particular, red states have been singled out. And the Brennan Center is definitely a left of center think tank with a particular agenda around voting rights. And so its definition of restrictive is pretty broad. And I'll talk in a second about the fact that some of that may very well be overblown when you hold it up to scrutiny from what we know from scholarship. One piece that I want to highlight here is that there are the laws that concern me the most are the laws that's the wrong map. No, it's just mislabeled. These are the states that have enacted laws that allow the legislature or other non-election officials to intervene in elections in the midterm, and there's a few more states that go into effect for the general election. And these are perhaps some of the most concerning. Hopefully elections go smoothly and this doesn't become an issue. But if this becomes an issue, this is, I think, a place where it will really challenge people's confidence in elections because it will make the process seem much, much more partisan. So if you ask me what my wish is for this election, it's for no election to be close and for it not to be close in states where legislatures have taken steps for it to allow them to step in to this process. And I keep looking at this map because Georgia should be highlighted on this map as well. And there might be one or two other maps or states that are missing. And I apologize for not having the better map here. There are also some other particular challenges that are happening around election challengers. And I I wish I wasn't telling a partisan story here, but the empirical fact of the matter is that most of this is coming from Republican challengers. There are certainly places where Democrats are talking about fighting fire with fire. But one of the risks, and it was a concern, and I had similar slides to this, quite frankly, going into the 2020 election, and then it was a big fat nothing. This wasn't an issue. But there's considerable concern among election officials, if you talk to election officials around the country, which I do, that we will have disruption at early voting and polling places with challenges to challenge voters on whether they're able to vote. This is particularly acute in states that have same-day registration or election day registration, that there will be challenging to people trying to vote in those states. There is also a great deal of continuing lawsuits. Mail ballots have now become a partisan issue where Democrats seem to be saying yes, Republicans seem to be saying no. These are some of the headlines. We obviously know it right here in Saratoga County because the lawsuit here in New York was filed here. But this is across states. And one of the concerning things about this is this fight will not end with Election Day. I put Pennsylvania on here because people in Pennsylvania are very concerned, as was the case in 2020, that this will be the point of litigation that will drag things out. I do want to talk about Georgia. And again, there's always a typo in my slides, and this is the one here. This should say 2022 primary. After this law was passed, and in fact, we're getting early data, right? There are two schools of thought. One is that the sky is falling, that's Chicken Little on the left, right? And the other is that there's nothing to worry about. And I think the jury is very much out on this law. And in fact, we've now had I guess we're now coming up on 3 days of early voting in Georgia. And the early in-person turnout is higher than it was in previous elections. Especially the 2018 election. And this is one of the things that folks in Georgia were saying. Yes, they made mail ballots more challenging. That was their intent. They made no bones about that, but they made early in-person voting more accessible. And so we should see, and apparently are seeing, at least in the early data and from the primary, people voting before Election Day and doing it early in person. And so we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. I do want to highlight what we know about some of these disputes is that small changes do matter in participation. Even things as small as the website quality, and we have an absolutely terrible website here for online voter registration in New York, makes a difference in how many people successfully register. Early voting locations and early voting hours, which is something that we fought about in many states prior to 2020 and has essentially disappeared from kind of the legal conflict landscape. Mail ballot drop boxes and other things about mail ballot applications do make a difference. We're not talking about huge differences here. We're talking about 0.5 percentage point, 1 percentage point, 2 percentage points. So it's not a sea change, but when elections are close, those matter. The thing that matters even more than that is confusion about elections. The American public has become more and more confused about how elections work. A primary culprit of that is that we now get national news coverage. My students here in Saratoga Springs at Skidmore know more about the laws in Georgia and Pennsylvania than they do about the laws in New York, because their news media comes from the national news outlets. They get their news from places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, from Fox News and from CNN, and they don't know what the local rules are. And we have a great deal of confusion about that. This confusion then lowers efficacy and turnout, people's willingness to participate in politics overall, and then it also undermines the confidence in the outcome. That problem of people seeing problems somewhere else. Their own vote is fine. What they experience at the polls is generally very good. But then, of course, with problems. I briefly want to talk about the counting process, and then I promise I'll stop yammering at you. Unlike my students, you all will remember the then picture. So I told you a few minutes ago about what my hope is for after the 2022 election. My biggest fear is that we're going to have flashbacks to Florida 2000, in particular because there are places that are moving towards hand counting ballots or hand recounts in places that are close. And that we are going to have nightmares about, like we had in Florida, hopefully not with hanging chads, our technology is much better, but those long extended recounts. I want to emphasize that the time it takes to count ballots is a feature, not a bug. The systems are designed this way, where if you've experienced elections here in New York, we don't even start counting absentee ballots until several days after election day. So when elections are close, we can't know on election night if we have large numbers of mail ballots. And this is the graph of when votes were counted and that percentage. There's also this now well-established phenomenon of what is sometimes referred to as the blue shift, where later ballots tend to move in a Democratic direction. A lot of this has to do with the processing of mail ballots, but it also has something to do with the fact that larger jurisdictions, which tend to be cities that tend to lean Democratic, are counted more, take longer to report their results. To answer Chris's question, I think it will help in any state that has expedited it, including here in New York, to count ballots earlier. I think the biggest thing is I wish the news media would do a better job of educating voters not to expect this on election night. This is not a sporting event. We are not guaranteed to know the winner. And overtime can last a long time. And this is particularly true in some states that will matter a great deal to how people think about this, where, if the balance in the US Senate comes down to Arizona, Arizona's system is designed not to know for a couple of days because of the way they process their absentee ballots. And something like half to 2/3 of the ballots in Arizona will be cast by mail. The House could come down to a handful of congressional seats in states that have deadlines where ballots that are postmarked on election day, so they're not even in the hands of election officials until a couple of days after election day. I think that whatever the benefit of the New York law, if we get into that kind of situation where people are waiting on which party is going to control the House, which party is going to control the Senate, and it comes down to states that have made a very deliberate policy decision to count their ballots, that is going to undermine confidence, and that's a problem. I wish it weren't so, but it is. We have also seen that one of the unfortunate side effects of the rhetoric from President Trump and his allies, and again, that is not all Republicans. We talked about Liz Cheney and others at the top, and it's not all Republicans now. But we had this situation in Pennsylvania, a Republican primary, where the two candidates were sort of trading counter charges, and we've seen this elsewhere among Democrats and Republicans. But even more troubling is what's seeped into election administration itself, where we have election boards that are refusing to fulfill their statutory requirement. In both New Mexico and Pennsylvania, in their primaries this summer, the state election office had to go to court to have a court order to get the county to certify their elections. They could not declare the primary winners, who goes on the general election ballots, for the entire state, because we had county boards that said their own election wasn't legitimate. So they can't stop other counties, but they were refusing to certify their own county, and that freezes the state process. That could mean, if this happens in the general election, that we don't know who wins, or that states are missing senators, members of Congress. More troubling, the governor of that state may not be seated because we don't have a certified election. And this idea that we have the professionals who are running elections who are discrediting those elections is deeply problematic. In the midterm, becomes problematic when we have a more compressed timeline because of the Electoral College and the presidential election. This is really a terrifying prospect. And if you want to talk about something that is going to undermine confidence, these kinds of headlines, and if they're holding up knowing for the nation who's getting the 50th or 51st vote in the Senate to control the Senate, who's winning who is officially going to be seated in Congress, in the House to have a majority. These are the things that are truly nightmarish. And if all this isn't bad enough, I just want, I'm going to end with one more thing. This is a little bit of a personal thing for me. So before I moved here to upstate New York, I taught at LSU in Louisiana, University of Miami in Florida. You may remember, we recently had Hurricane Ian. Hurricane Michael went through in 2018, even later in October, and through some states. If you look at that path, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, that is control of the US Senate if we see turnout altered in those 3 states this year. It is potentially control of the House of Representatives. And I'm going to show you 2 hurricanes from September of this year. Obviously, we had Hurricane Ian that went through Florida and has massively disrupted the election administration there. Fortunately, Florida is used to this and has very good election administrators. And it also impacted a little bit North Carolina. Why am I showing you Hurricane Fiona that didn't make landfall into Newfoundland? I'm showing you that because if you just draw a line halfway between those 2 hurricane paths, you see something that looks like Hurricane Sandy, which we all remember well and is disruptive. All these challenges that we're facing that are these kind of short-term things of the change in the way that people voted in 2020, in dealing with what has become an increasingly toxic rhetoric. We saw a lot of it in 2020. And as I said before, I fear that we could see it from Democrats in 2022 if things don't go well in some or lots of places for them in a partisan sense, or even more so in future elections. But we also have these much larger, literally global challenges that we need to deal with. The fact that we conduct elections and we have many states that are in the path of hurricanes. And that's not to mention the fact that we have smaller jurisdictions that out west that are hit by forest fires. We always have the risk of earthquakes. These are tremendously disruptive and potentially can swing the national balance, Congress and the presidency, as well as having major impacts in those states in ways that we are just not prepared to deal with because we are so closely divided as a country right now. All right, I talked for a little bit longer than I said I would, so I apologize for that. Hopefully this was useful and interesting. I have tons of stuff that I didn't talk about, so fire away with questions, and I'm happy to answer whatever I can. This doesn't strike me as a speechless group.
I think you presented so many facts that are so dismaying that it's hard to really get your mind around these things. One thing I would say is that New York State did change so that now we're counting those absentee ballots before Election Day. Yeah. Although that's another change because then people who would normally have thought, oh, they can go and appear on Election Day and that will count instead of the absentee ballot. But no, that part of the whole thing has changed.
Yeah, and thank you to you and Chris, who gently corrected me in the question. We did make that change. And one thing that's important, and I would encourage you to be very careful about the way we talk about this, which is the ballots are processed, but they're not actually counted until Election Day, right? But they are taken out of those envelopes. And that was the process that we used to keep until after Election Day. And that's why you can't go in on Election Day, because we've already put your ballot in that stack to be counted when it's time to count them. This issue of when and how we count ballots is just, it is something that before 2020, I don't think anybody thought much about outside of the proud but small tribe of election nerds. But now it is something that we really have to think about, and these policy choices are having big consequences. There's a lot of attention in public administration, scholars and election officials on trying to figure out, used to be a lot of attention to things like election audits to make sure we got the election right. And nobody thought much about the time that it took to do this, right? The emphasis was on getting it right. And now the time is incredibly important, and the way the media talks about that time. So to indulge myself about my own research project that I did and got suggestive results, and I'm in the process of replicating it right now, is presenting people in the context of a survey with 2 different news stories. One of which talks about vote counting in the way that the news media often does. Oh, we got a new batch of votes and so has pulled ahead. Now they're ahead, right? As if it's the play-by-play of some sporting event, right? This team is winning in the first quarter, now the second quarter, and then now this team is pulled ahead because they're playing better. Well, that's not how vote counting works. The game is not going on anymore. We're just counting up the score. But that's the way the news media presents it, versus a way that is much more focused on, we're just counting up ballots that have already been cast. And then after reading those stories, I asked people about their confidence in the election and a variety of other outcomes. And if we could get the news media away from this kind of over-dramatized sports commentary way of talking about counting, that alone would do a lot to boost confidence. And so there are some ways without changing the system that we can boost confidence. I have a question from Chris Alexander again. What's the most effective way for us to bring more confidence back to elections? Man, if I knew the answer to that, that would be great. I think there are some concrete steps. So one of the reasons that I took a moment to have that aside at the beginning about the fact that our election officials are not staffed to communicate, but are grappling with the fact that they now need to communicate. One is that we need much better communication about how our elections work. The lack of knowledge is truly staggering about what people don't know. I did highlight in the middle of the presentation, the nationalization of news is a real problem. It has a major impact on confidence, on participation, a variety of other measures. And so we either need to nationalize our election system so that our national media can just tell one story, or we need to figure out ways to communicate about local. And in the best run countries, it usually is a standard nationalized system that is, and with that, it becomes easier. It takes less resources to sort of educate voters about that system. But so I mentioned being in Montreal, and there were folks from the province of Ontario, their election. I was in a small group, there were about a dozen of us talking about this, and we went around and they were some of the last people to speak, and we were talking primarily about elections in the United States. And they just shook their heads and said, these are not problems that we have in Canada. Because yes, we run provincial elections, but we work in this system where every election is the same. It's the same in every province. You can move from one end of Canada to the other. The election rules are always the same. So we don't have this kind of uncertainty, and it is that uncertainty and that variation from place to place that allows so much of the rhetoric that is confusing. I wish I had a better answer for you there, Chris. Pat is not in the public chat, but she messaged me privately. What do we know about foreign actors or other actors? I'm going to generalize the question to other actors. We know that social media is a huge problem. And the fact that information floods into people outside of the news media. So I've been picking on the news media. I've done some work with those social media companies trying to figure that out. It is an enormous challenge. I am not going to defend them as having done a good job because they haven't. But it is clearly something that we need to do better. That opportunity for misinformation and misinformation to spread and misinformation to be validated in social media is a big part of the challenge. And oftentimes that misinformation, one of the challenges for those kind of social media platforms that make an attempt to do it is if someone is in Georgia and shares something about the Georgia rules with someone who is in Alabama or Florida or South Carolina, it's not misinformation. It's correct about Georgia, but those people in other states then become confused because they're like, wait, that's not how I understood elections. And then we get this confusion. And where do you draw the line of misinformation? How do you police that? And it becomes a real challenge. The foreign actors, we don't know much for sure. We do know there was a big Senate investigation, Senate Intelligence Committee-led investigation, bipartisan report that's very clear that there was deliberate foreign attempts. They point fingers specifically at Iran and Russia, but also a number of other actors that are unidentified in terms of their affiliation, that were intentionally doing that. But exactly the scope and what we can do about it is not clear. When Monica asks what instruction I would give the news media, I try not in these talks to talk too much about my own research, but I'm doing a big project funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, first to understand the way the news media does talk about this. So one of the things that became clear in 2020, as I was sort of starting to scratch the surface, is that we actually have no idea. So in what was a small project in 2020, where we analyzed the news content of the day before Election Day and the day of Election Day, in the national news media and TV stations from 25 media markets around the country, some of the stereotypical stories, like everybody ran a story, but there were lines at the polls because there was always at least one polling place that had a long line. So that was problematic. But I was partnering with someone who's done a lot of research on the way the news media covers campaigns and the way they frame everything in the game frame, that is in the kind of sports metaphors. And she came into it expecting not to see much about the voting process and to see a tremendous amount about this, which candidate is winning and losing kind of coverage that is a staple of it. And actually what we find is there's more coverage of the voting process in that period than there in not only in 2020, but 2018 and 2016 as well. So it wasn't just a 2020 driven phenomenon, which has blown away scholars of news media, but we literally know almost nothing else. There's a handful of studies. We know when states have early voting, the news media covers campaigns earlier, cover them slightly differently earlier. We really don't know. But part of this project that we were doing to catalog that and do a series of experiments like I described with the lines, with the vote counting about different aspects of election administration to try to identify different ways that the news media can be more effective in big ways and small ways. Everything from, is it helpful to have a link to the League of Women Voters or the local election office as a trusted source of more information than they can possibly put into their news story because they have limited time, to very different ways of presenting and framing the visuals on TV, the way in which they write the stories. So stay tuned. When I do this talk next time, I'll have a lot to say about that. Maybe that'll be my theme next time. Cherie's question, sorry, reading this as we go here. Do some states have older machines? Our machines are quite good here in New York. And so are most of the machines. The big place where I think there's concern about the machines is the states that are still using touch screens, because there's a lot of distrust for them. Look for, there's a Homer Simpson episode about touch screens that dates back to the mid-2000s, where Homer's trying to vote for one candidate and it keeps coming up the other. And right about now, late October in every election year is when that starts to float around the internet again. And so that's the biggest issue. Most of the places that are problematic in terms of machines are gone. We do have a push towards more hand counting or automatic hand recounting. Some of that has been going on for a while in terms of audits. This is really getting into the weeds, but related to the vote counting speed. One of the things we do here in New York is that every precinct has a machine that counts the votes, and then those are transmitted, those totals are transmitted to the county clerk, and then the machines are taken, and that's part of the certification process to check those totals. There are a number of counties that have the kind of paper ballot that we fill out, and then it goes into a locked box. But it isn't actually counted until that box of ballots is transmitted back to the county elections office, all stacked up and then run together through machines. So one of the reasons that we are going to wait on election night for votes to come in late is when counties have this central count system. And then you are, polls close, whatever time they close, right? They close at 7, they close at 8, they close at 9, but they can't even start to count those ballots. They can't even unlock those ballots for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And they're all going into one facility and they're all put in a big long line. And they're opening those boxes and neatening them up and putting them in the scanning machine. And that's the kind of thing that people are going to see as a vulnerability. Who was in possession of those ballots when they went from the polling place to the central count? What happens to them? And so if you want to have really an experience that's like watching paint dry on election night, a number of counties, especially these central count counties around the country, live stream this whole process. They'll have a series of camera. You can be like a security guard with it looks like Zoom, right? You'll have a whole bunch of little cameras where you can watch the ballots through this whole process as they're being counted to try to have transparency. But that system is particularly sensitive to being to sort of the question marks around it. So it's less about hanging chads and it's more about chain of custody and what's happening to these ballots and the validation. There was a story in Politico the other day, another place that I had not thought of, and the headline was "The Election Hack That You've Never Thought Of," about concerns from some election officials because some states use old non-secure modems, or some states use phoning in election results from the precincts to the election officials, and then those are reported to the news media about who's winning and losing. If those systems get hacked, then what the information the news media is using and sharing with the public is not right. Ultimately, we'll have the right winners. But if a county says candidate X is ahead by 5,000 votes, and then they go, no, we actually checked the machines, and 2 days later they say another county, you can see how this is going to be a problem. And if you want an example of how this can go badly, we all remember the Iowa Democratic primary in 2020 when they were trying to phone in the results, and it went, it was so bad that Iowa was going to lose its place at the front of the line in presidential primaries, right? But that was by accident. That was because the system didn't work. A malevolent actor who's trying to disrupt that system could wreak havoc. I have friends who work on the decision desks at the networks and the AP looking at this data as it comes in, and like they've always checked it twice, but now they're going to check it 4 times. So we're going to see later election calls. We're hopefully going to see much less definitiveness about those election calls because there's this vulnerability in the system. Is there any chance of moving to national election administration? Probably not. Partially because our constitutional system is grounded on federalism. But largely because even when we have seen, this is why House HR1, one of the many reasons that HR1, which is a vastly ambitious bill, ran aground is when you start talking about nationalizing election administration. Remember that map those maps that I showed you about cost of voting? You can make those maps of just about any. So we have to standardize. Do states have online voter registration? Some states do. Some states have made a policy decision not to have it. Election day registration, same day registration, early voting, no excuse absentee. Right here in New York, we voted it down. Just last year, New York doesn't want that, but California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington. I mean, Washington hasn't had in-person voting in more than a dozen years. They don't want to, they're going to oppose a national system that says they have to offer in-person voting. 65% of voters in Texas vote early. You're going to take that away from them? But are you going to force more early voting in other states? It's hard to see how that you build a coalition to have that. As much as outside observers would say the number one thing that the United States could do is standardize its election administration. I mean, I said that. I can sit in my ivory tower as a scholar and say, that's the solution. Politically, do I think we get there? Very hard to see. And even if we did that, we still have local election officials administering it. And we have national laws like the motor voter law around voter registration, or the National Voter Registration Act. States implement that in all kinds of different ways. So getting there is tough. Man, I am just like nothing but negativity tonight, which unfortunately is kind of my state of mind about this a lot of the time. But you know, this is the reality. I mean, Pat talked about the Siena poll and the headlines of people are worried about democracy, but it's not a voting priority. You know, unfortunately, this is where a lot of the American public is, and it's really distressing to me to see that, because I don't want us to wake up too late. So if I am, you know, doom and gloom about this, it's because I'm delivering this message in every place I can to try to get people's attention about it. Man, I feel like I've been talking a lot. Questions? More questions? All right.
Thanks
Pat, I'll
so
turn it back over
much.
to you if you want to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Chris. You gave us a lot of information. I think I will need melatonin tonight. But you know, it's for what is it? Forewarned is forearmed, or something like that. We need to know what we're heading into. The league is so grounded in believing in the democratic process and believing in being a nonpartisan organization that wants everyone to have a clear the opportunity to be heard and the right to have their vote counted. So these kinds of forums really, really matter to all of us. So thank you. Any closing words from Lori or anybody? Monica?
If I can just offer one closing piece, which is something that comes up in almost every conversation that I have with election officials. And since I've been talking about all kinds of politics, I'm going to go into religion, sort of. Regardless of your religion, you're probably familiar with the Lord's Prayer. Election officials often, sort of jokingly, but mostly serious, talk about the election officials' prayer. And it ends with the following words that is really the answer to a lot of the concerns that I expressed, which is, Lord, let it not be close. Most of these problems in non-close elections, right, then we have breathing space to deal with problems and concerns. It is when elections get close, either individual elections or as we are with the House, the Senate, many state legislatures around the country, those close elections. So whatever your faith, your religion, whatever you want to call it, add some version of the election administrator's prayer to your worship practice, because we need the help from all of the higher beings to make sure that we have the karma, the good luck to not have close elections.
Okay, so Lori, talk a little bit just for a second about how this will be available to be seen in the future for people who couldn't make it.
Yeah, so we always post the recordings on our website. I'm trying to remember. I think it's where the blogs are. Is that right, Monica?
Yes, it's if you go into the news and blog section, you'll see a photo and videos area, and you'll see this event listed under there. I'll also be posting it to our Facebook page and Twitter. And if, bottom line, you can't find it, you can always reach out to us at president@LWVSC.org.
Will we also automatically send the recording to everybody who registered?
I don't usually do that, but I can.
I had one person ask about it who had to leave early, so maybe we could.
I can do that.
All right, thank you.
We'll figure that out. Chris, I don't suspect we're going to let you go easily as far as involvement with the league because you're so knowledgeable. So we're sure you'll hear from us again. Thanks very much. You're muted.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.
All right, have a good night.